Hey everybody, Relay here. Welcome to another segment of Flop or Not, a game review series where I determine whether a game flops or if it doesn't. And today we'll be taking a look at the newly released Skull and Bones, which is both developed and published by Ubisoft. Now, Skull and Bones is a sort of action-adventure game, which seems to be getting a lot of controversy from a large portion of players, notably from those who've played Ubisoft's prior title, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and those who've played Sea of Thieves. But those are things I'll get into a little bit later on in the review. As always, beginning with character customization. So upon creating your character, you'll notice that you have a few presets to choose from, and these presets are face presets. Now, again, it's a little bit of a shame that we can't customize the details a little bit further, like your eyebrows, your facial structure, but the presets that we're left with are somewhat diverse and still give you a few options as to how you want to look. You're also able to customize your hair, which is a given, your eye color, as well as your facial hair and or any kind of cosmetic addition like any kind of scars or tattoos. And as far as the body goes, there's again even less customization. You're faced with a different type of body habituses that you can pick through. So there's skinny, there's large, there's muscular, and average. So do I wish there was more in terms of character creation? Yes. Does it leave a little bit to be desired? Absolutely. But the character models aren't entirely ugly themselves. Now, since we're on the subject of character customization and the equipment in this game doesn't really do anything in terms of bonuses, we're going to go ahead and just go to the vanity section and take a look at all the different clothes and jewelry that you can use to kind of accessorize your character. And surprisingly, in that section, in terms of customization, there's quite a bit of clothing to choose from, as well as jewelry, and you can always find these in various different merchants, and you can find them not just in the main locale, but also scattered across the different tribes and the different factions in the game, which is kind of neat to see. But again, do keep in mind that all of these items are purely cosmetic and don't really have any functional use. But giving credit to Ubisoft where it's due, they do have quite a bit in terms of style that you can customize your character with. Heading now towards the environment. So the environment, you spend most of your time on the ship, where you'll be glad to hear that the weather is pretty dynamic, meaning during the time of day, things can change from clear to cloudy to stormy based on the region where you find yourself. Another thing that's nice and simulates realism is that the time also changes as you're sailing. So you can sail from dawn all the way up until dusk and back to dawn if you wanted to. Now, I do still have a bit of a bone to pick with this game in terms of environment though. So there are points where you can actually leave your ship to go and run certain errands and sell and trade with the traders. But I find the aspect of just walking on land and interacting with other NPCs is incredibly lackluster. Like, I've had, even with the main story, I guess if you even consider it the main story, I find the dialogues to be so bland that I can't for the life of me even care for what's being said half the time. I find myself wanting to just go right back out to the ship because there's nothing to do on the islands, or nothing to do on the main island as well. The only thing you can do there really is trade. Even the random NPCs, you can't talk to them, you can't really do anything with them. So they don't really provide any value. It just feels like an empty world populated with brainless NPCs that are not even interactable. So that's something that really bugs me in open world games, where it shows that there's a lack of effort. And yeah, that's just one of my quarrels that I had with the environment. Everything on land could have been improved significantly. For example, they could have implemented a combat mechanic on land as well, and I felt that would have made like a more well-rounded game. And yes, I do know it's a pirate game, but you can still have skirmishes with pirates on land. So just to reiterate, the environment, while it's dynamic and when you're on the ship, everything's more or less fine, it does leave a lot to be desired outside of anything related to do with the ship. Like any kind of interactable NPC, forget about it. There's nothing there to be had. So that's just my take on it. Occasionally you'll find treasure maps and stuff where they'll bring you to a location where you can kind of decipher based on what's shown on the scroll where you have to be to dig up the treasure. And that's kind of cool. It's like a little treasure hunt. And there's other different activities. Like, for example, there are random boss encounters in the game, which you'll fight like this giant prehistoric sea monster. Here's an example.
Hello, motherfucker.
And this part is kind of cool. I've always liked running into different encounters like that, so that's nice to see. It shows that they can also implement surprises here and there that add to the game. I enjoy seeing these kind of encounters because while they might be goofy, they add a bit of challenge to the game as well. And of course, this game has a heavy aspect on grinding for materials as well as just getting overall loot. So for example, you constantly need to replenish your crew's stamina, and for that you need food, any kind of food, but generally you want cooked food because it'll give you more stamina boost. And stamina is used whenever you're accelerating with your ship at a fast pace. So they consistently need this food source, which means that you have to consistently gather it, and it does become less tedious as you can buy these things eventually in game, which really, if you have enough money, it's not really an issue. But there are resource gathering points where you'll be spending a lot of your time, I find. So whether or not the grind is for you, it can kind of determine how you're going to play. So if you're one for exploration, there's no shortage of things to explore. You can also play this game less aggressive. There are different quests that'll just ask you to deliver certain goods to another part on the map, which if you want to go a passive route, that's fine as well. But for those of you who don't feel like grinding quite a bit, you may as well just create like an attacker ship, like a ramming ship, and deal damage and loot some highly valuable stuff from enemy ships. Alright, moving on now to the details and graphics. So the game, especially when sailing, is actually quite nice looking. It looks beautiful. The character details are okay, even like I mentioned, and again, I always want to reiterate that details and graphics don't really make a game great. It's the effort and how enjoyable the game is that makes a game great. And just to say though, the character details are not really polished at all. Sometimes you'll see just random NPCs, you'll walk past them and they're talking, but their mouths aren't moving and they're making all these wacky animations, and it just doesn't jive. Like, how are they talking? Is it telepathy? I got no clue. On top of that, the animations when speaking to different characters, their facial animations are considerably dulled down. Like, there's nothing to it. Like, you'll get the occasional eyebrow raise, but otherwise you'll see the facial expressions in the mouth change and the eyes won't reflect that. It almost feels uncanny sometimes. But on its own right, the game still looks quite nice when you're on islands, and again when you're on the ship. And so that's where you'll spend the majority of your time, and that's where it counts. Stumbling our way into the story section now. I don't even know if I can really call this a story, if I'm being honest. This was never meant to be a story game. You can tell just by analyzing your gameplay within the first hour, you notice that it's meant to be an adventure game, not an RPG game. And so me mentioning the story here doesn't really matter, but the story is completely lackluster. I find, at least for myself, I have been having a hard time paying attention to what's even happening. All I know is this captain has kind of like a vendetta against La Compagnie, which is a large French company, for lack of better words, and he feels like everybody's against him, so he wants to become the strongest power around. And at this point in the game, which is fairly early on, your job is to kind of help him do so. Now, during the dialogue with the quests that you complete for him or the quests that you partake with them, they give you like 2 redundant options to reply to him, or maybe a couple more to any dialogue really, but these have no influence on the outcome of the dialogue and don't change it in any way, aside from, you know, maybe picking just something out of the sake of just wanting to be a dick. Moving on now to the battle mechanics, which is the part I like to cover the most. So to start, I should preface this by saying, as I mentioned earlier, the only fighting that you ever do in this game is on your ship. There's no on-land fighting, so we're just going to focus on basically the ship itself. So the ship can be customized in many different ways, and that'll include your arsenal and how you defend your ship with your armor. But we'll get onto that in the equipment and gear section. All you need to know is that you have strategic placement of where you want to put certain cannons or certain torpedo launchers and certain different type of weapons. So once you get out to sea, you'll notice that the enemies have often weak points that are highlighted, and some boats do travel in packs and you might find the occasional stray boat, but generally you're trying to target the weak spot, which is like a critical spot for the enemy, and these are easily highlighted in red whenever you come up against an enemy ship. Now, most of the combat will be done with you trying to strafe around the enemy in order to obtain like the optimal angle to use whichever weapon you have. So whether they're in front of you, it's going to be your bow weapon. If they're on the right or the starboard side, it'll be whatever weapon you have there, which can vary from a different cannon, maybe a shorter range cannon or a longer range cannon. And the same applies to the weapons on your left side or your port side. Prior to getting into battle, it's important to at least prepare yourself with a sufficient amount of food, so stamina for your crew, and repair kits and different kits that'll allow you to repair a status if you're taking on water or if you're suffering from some kind of ailment. There are certain missions that require you to do what's called plundering, where you're going to plunder and attack like a settlement, and you can even do this without being in a mission, but you'll notice that these locations to plunder are much more heavily guarded, and they call in reinforcements as the plundering continues, so you'll meet more and more resistance as you're taking the loot, which is kind of like and it almost feels like a domination type game style. If you leave that general area that you're trying to plunder and you don't make it back within a minute or so, then you will lose that plunder and whatever loot that comes with it. Now you can actually join in on other players plundering, and they can join in with you plundering and kind of give you a helping hand while achieving the same goal. So that's something that's cool to see. This game is very beneficial for people who are playing co-op, and I believe that's the way it's meant to be played. And as far as PvP goes, I haven't really had a good chance to experience that, and to this point I don't think I've ever seen anybody shoot at each other, so I'm assuming it's going to be included somewhere in the game, but not this early on, so I can't really speak to that. So for battle mechanics, just note that there are enemies that generally have weak spots which you're going to want to target and take advantage of, and once you get the enemies weak enough to a certain point, you have a function that allows you to board the enemy, and this is where you can basically act like a finisher and completely destroy the vessel regardless of what health they're at, and acquire bonus loot while doing so. The part that I think they missed out on with this is that, again, they didn't implement any boarding. Like when you're boarding the enemy, typically you'd have your crew going over as well as yourself to plunder whatever loot, and they missed out on an opportunity to implement a battle mechanic where you're actually running around as yourself and, you know, having sword fights with enemies. But maybe it was too much to ask. I often think this is where people are trying to compare it to Assassin's Creed Black Flag, where, you know, a game that came out how many years ago now is kind of superior in terms of variety for combat, and it's kind of sad to see. It almost feels like they took a step back, which is weird considering how long it's been, and the fact that this game was originally destined to be like a DLC for Assassin's Creed. Heading towards the difficulty now. The game can be difficult, especially if you're playing it alone, because obviously you won't have support from other players. So when you're attacking settlements and, you know, you're plundering, for example, if you find yourself alone and you're not prepared, there's a chance that you'll lose. Obviously this varies, and the difficulty in general will vary on how overpowered your ship is and your crew, what level you are, and how beefed up your gear is on your ship. Obviously early game opponents won't stand a chance with a ship that's stacked up to the nines. So I think over time the difficulty can be mitigated while just upgrading, and you will be able to eventually work around more or less any enemy, even by yourself. There are a couple enemies like this boss here, the prehistoric boss that I mentioned earlier on, that kicked my ass quite a few times. I honestly was not able to outrun it, and I think this would be beneficial to attack with multiple teammates, and it probably would have helped my odds quite a bit. So the difficulty all in all is, I'd say, maybe slightly harder than average, but even then it can quickly become fairly trivial if you upgrade your ship and spend time actually building your ship properly. Getting into equipment and gear customization now, this is where the game shines. Obviously you have a variety of different tools at your arsenal here, but we'll start with the ships. So you can build a different variety of ships. There are some ships that are made to deal extra damage. So for example, there's a ship that excels at ramming people, and there are ships that are made to tank, which are like defender ships, and there are ships that are made to kind of provide a support role so they can heal. In addition to healing themselves automatically, they can heal other players or repair other players, however you want to word it. And each of these ships can be built in their own respective way, which is limitless based on what you want. For example, if you want to make a ship that is very good in close quarters, you can equip weapons that are called like demi cannons, which fire fast and have a quick reload time and produce like a scatter, like a shotgun blast almost, and these are very effective. You can also have ships that fire from a long distance with these longer cannons and they can shoot from almost twice the distance as the average cannon would, which makes up for a great amount of distance if the enemy is faster than you. There's also torpedoes and mortars, so there's an arsenal of stuff to choose from, and these all have different applications, so you're probably better off, if you're alone that is, to have kind of one of each. So I've got a regular set of cannons which provide good support at an average range. I've got one of those demi cannons which are like a shotgun blast for close range encounters, and on my bow side, if they're much faster than I am and they're running away, I have the long cannons to hit from a very far range, up to 1,000 meters. So that's how I built my ship, and I've had pretty good success with it. And of course, you can customize plethora of different cosmetic options on your ship. You can have some cosmetic items that actually kind of help. There's furniture on the ship which give you like micro buffs and passive features which actually help you depending on what your gear is. Some of it is gear specific, so just be careful and look out for that. And obviously there's also different paint jobs, as well as different sails and different logos that you can kind of throw on there and designs. And these are all purely cosmetic. The other functional aspect is armor. You can add armor to your ship to give it a bit more sustainability in terms of just taking damage. For the ship customization, I also wanted to discuss blueprints because they're an important part of upgrading your ship. So throughout the environment, you'll find different areas where blueprints can be found, either from traders or from treasures, and these will allow you to craft the blueprint at the blacksmith. So those blueprints are definitely things you want to keep an eye out for if you're planning on upgrading your ship. So here we are at the verdict. Does Skull and Bones flop or does it not? While the game itself isn't horrible, there are too many shortcomings to overlook in this game to consider it not a flop. It's very close to a flop, although it's just barely staying over the flop or not line because of the fact that you can probably have quite a bit of fun if you have a few friends to play with you, and it'll enhance the experience to a point where you might not be miserable, especially when spending a full AAA price of $79.99 CAD on this game. The only other game that I remember reviewing that was even this close to a flop was Forspoken, and that was made by Square Enix, and it was by all accounts pretty much a dumpster fire, dead on arrival. That being said, I wouldn't recommend this game to anybody unless it was at a significant discount, because just playing full price for a game that feels like it's lacking, especially when compared to its much older counterpart, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, it just can't be justified. Anywho, like, dislike, comment, subscribe. If you want to see more, let me know. Take her easy.